My husband's funeral was meant to be a moment of dignified farewell, until my daughter-in-law stood up and accused me of faking my grief. "Those are crocodile tears," she shouted for everyone to hear. What she didn't realize was that in challenging my mourning, she would force our family to confront truths we'd been avoiding for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. At 73, I've lived long enough to know that life's most important lessons often arrive disguised as its cruelest moments. I was born in a small town in Vermont, Lakefield, population 2,087, where generations of hardworking people had learned to weather both harsh winters and personal hardships with the same stoic resilience. In Lakefield, expressions of emotion were considered almost impolite, a cultural inheritance from generations of New Englanders who believed that character was revealed not through words, but through actions. Our family home stood on Maple Street, a white clapboard structure built by my grandfather in 1918, with a front porch where neighbors would gather on summer evenings to discuss town affairs without ever venturing into personal matters. Inside those walls, I learned the unspoken rules of emotional restraint that would shape my entire life. My father, William Hayes, taught history at the local high school and maintained the town's historical society records in his spare time. He was a man of few words but profound integrity, someone who believed that promises made should never require reminding, and that a person's worth lay in their reliability rather than their charm. "Feelings are private, but integrity is public," he would say, his weathered hands steady whether he was building a stone wall or comforting a grieving neighbor who had lost a son in Vietnam. What you feel belongs to you alone. What you do affects everyone around you. My mother, Elizabeth, reinforced these lessons through her own quiet strength. When her sister died unexpectedly of an aneurysm, leaving 3 young children, my mother simply adjusted our household to accommodate 3 more place settings at dinner, 3 more beds in upstairs rooms, without ever discussing the grief that must have accompanied her sister's passing. The only visible evidence of her mourning was a single pressed flower from the funeral preserved in her Bible, which I discovered years later after her own passing. This was the environment that shaped me, a world where love was expressed through reliability, grief through service, and joy through the simple acknowledgement of good fortune rather than celebration. By the time I left for college at the University of Vermont, these principles were so deeply ingrained that I didn't recognize them as a specific cultural inheritance rather than universal human behavior. Burlington exposed me to different ways of being in the world, to people who expressed emotions openly and without apology. My roommate Diane, a theater major from New Jersey, moved through life with an expressive freedom that both fascinated and uncomfortable me. She cried at movies, laughed until she couldn't breathe at jokes, and fell in and out of passionate relationships with an intensity that seemed exhausting. "Eleanor, you're like a beautiful lake with everything happening beneath the surface," she told me once during our junior year. "I keep waiting to see ripples, but your waters stay perfectly still." It wasn't a criticism exactly, but I recognized something in her observation that would be echoed by others throughout my life. After graduating with my English degree, I returned to Vermont, not to Lakefield, but to Burlington, where I secured a teaching position at South Burlington High School. Teaching literature provided a safe way to discuss emotions, analyzing the grief of Hamlet or the passion of Catherine and Heathcliff without requiring personal disclosure. My students often commented on my ability to guide them through emotional, literary landscapes while maintaining a certain professional distance. I met Richard during my second year teaching. He was the new mathematics instructor, transferred from a private school in Massachusetts, brilliant and methodical in ways that complemented my more intuitive approach to English literature. Where I saw patterns in human stories, he found elegance in equations. His classroom was across from mine, and I would often observe him staying late, meticulously grading papers with a red pen, his handwriting as precise as his thinking. RC. Courtship, if it could be called that, was as measured as our professional lives. Coffee in the faculty lounge became occasional lunches, which evolved into discussions of books and ideas over dinner. Richard's New England upbringing had instilled in him the same emotional reserve that characterized my family, though his manifested differently, not as stoicism in the face of difficulty, but as careful consideration before any emotional commitment. "Appreciate your thoughtfulness," he told me 6 months after we began seeing each other. Coming from him, this was a profound compliment, acknowledging the deliberate way I approached both ideas and relationships. When he proposed 3 months later, it was without grand gestures or emotional declarations, just a carefully considered question and a vintage ring that had belonged to his grandmother. We were married in the summer of 1975, a small ceremony, in a Burlington church followed by a reception at the University Faculty Club. Photographs from that day show two people with matching expressions of contained satisfaction rather than overflowing joy, exactly what we both expected and wanted from the occasion. We purchased a Victorian home in Burlington's older neighborhood, a house with enough character to be interesting, but solid enough to be practical. Evenings were spent reading in the study we had created from a former bedroom, discussing ideas rather than feelings, building a life characterized by mutual respect and shared values rather than passionate declarations. Our son James was born. After 5 years of marriage, the result of deliberate planning rather than spontaneous desire. From his earliest days, he showed signs of his father's analytical nature. Where other infants might cry from generalized discomfort, James seemed to express specific needs that could be methodically addressed. His toys were arranged rather than scattered, his responses to the world careful and considered even in childhood. As he grew, James showed remarkable aptitude for structure and design. By age 7, he was creating elaborate buildings with his construction sets, explaining the function of each component with his father's precision. When he announced his intention to study architecture at MIT, neither Richard nor I was surprised. It seemed the natural extension of abilities evident since childhood. From the beginning, James was more like his father, analytical, precise, someone who processed emotions through intellectual understanding rather than expression. This served him well in his career as an architect, but created challenges in his personal relationships, particularly with women who mistook his emotional containment for lack of interest or feeling. His first serious relationship in college ended when his girlfriend accused him of not caring enough, a painful episode he recounted to us with bewilderment during a holiday break. "I designed a study space for her thesis work," he explained. "I spent 60 hours on the plans. How is that not caring?" Richard and I exchanged glances, recognizing in our son's confusion the gap between different languages of love, the expression through service and action that characterized our family versus the verbal and physical demonstrations others expected. We didn't have adequate words to explain this cultural divide to him, lacking as we did the vocabulary for emotional expression that might have helped him navigate these waters. When James met Melissa during a commercial design project in Boston, we were initially surprised by the match. Where our son was reserved and analytical, Melissa Catalano was expressive and intuitive. The daughter of Italian-American parents who had raised her in a household where emotions weren't just acknowledged but celebrated. Her family dinners were apparently loud, argumentative affairs, where feelings were expressed, disputes resolved, and affection demonstrated openly and without reservation. Melissa entered our family 20 years ago, a vibrant presence in our carefully ordered world. From the beginning, she was everything our family wasn't. Expressive, dramatic, someone who believed emotions should be displayed rather than simply experienced. Her Mediterranean background had taught her that feelings were meant to be externalized, a philosophy as foreign to our household as a tropical plant in northern soil. I still remember her first Christmas with our family, the bewilderment on her face as we exchanged carefully selected gifts with minimal ceremony, each present acknowledged, with sincere thanks but without the effusive expressions of delight she clearly expected. Later, I overheard her asking James if we were disappointed with our gifts, unable to interpret our contained responses as satisfaction rather than displeasure. The early years of their marriage seemed to involve ongoing translation between different emotional languages. James would describe spending weeks researching the perfect anniversary gift, while Melissa would express hurt that he hadn't verbalized his feelings about the occasion. She would prepare elaborate celebrations for milestones he hadn't realized needed marking, while he would carefully maintain their home systems and structure as his expression of commitment. The birth of their daughter Emma, 15 years ago, temporarily bridged some of these differences. Something about the vulnerability of a newborn allowed both approaches to caregiving to be valued. James's careful attention to safety and schedules, complementing Melissa's intuitive response to emotional needs. For a few years, they seemed to achieve a balance that honored both their styles. Over time, however, this fundamental difference in emotional expression created a gradual rift between our families. Where Melissa saw my restraint as coldness, I viewed her emotional displays as performative. Neither perspective was entirely fair, but they hardened into unspoken judgments that shaped our interactions, creating increasing distance despite living only 30 minutes apart. Family gatherings became exercises in careful navigation, with Richard serving as the mediator between different communication styles. He had a unique ability to bridge these differences during family gatherings, his quiet warmth creating space for both approaches without requiring either to change. He could respond appropriately to Melissa's expressive style without adopting it himself, and could translate our more reserved responses in ways she could better understand. "Your mother-in-law spent 3 days making that quilt for Emma," I once overheard him explaining to Melissa, who had been disappointed by my subdued response to her effusive thanks. "Each square represents a different literary work she thinks Emma might enjoy someday." That's how Eleanor expresses love, through thought and action rather than words. These tensions might have continued indefinitely, maintained in fragile balance by Richard's diplomatic interventions, if not for the diagnosis that would ultimately reveal the true depths of our family's communication challenges. When Richard experienced shortness of breath during a routine hike in the Green Mountains, I insisted on a medical examination despite his protests that he had simply overexerted himself. The diagnosis of congestive heart failure came as a shock, particularly given his lifelong habits of moderation and exercise. The cardiologist explained that some genetic factors had predisposed him to the condition, which could be managed but not cured. From that moment, our family's different approaches to emotion became more pronounced. James approached his father's illness methodically, researching treatments, organizing care schedules, and creating spreadsheets to track medications and symptoms. His way of showing concern was through problem-solving rather than emotional support. Exactly the approach Richard himself would have taken. Melissa brought a different energy to the situation, filling Richard's hospital room with flowers, music, and emotional encouragement. She visited frequently, often crying openly when his condition worsened, bringing homemade Italian food to tempt his diminishing appetite, and organizing prayer circles among her church community. Her grief and concern were visible, tangible, impossible to miss. Emma, at 13, seemed caught between these two approaches, sometimes sitting quietly with her grandfather, playing chess or discussing her schoolwork as if nothing had changed, other times expressing her fears and sadness in ways that reflected her mother's influence. I simply sat with my husband, holding his hand through long hospital nights, managing his medications, and maintaining the routines that gave structure to his diminishing days. My grief manifested in the careful attention I paid to his comfort, in memorizing the patterns of his breathing, in the silent promises I made during the pre-dawn hours when his pain was at its worst. The hospital staff seemed to understand my approach without explanation. "Mrs. Mitchell is always here," I overheard one nurse telling another during a shift change. She doesn't say much, but she notices everything. It was perhaps the most accurate description of my caregiving, and indeed my entire approach to love, I had ever heard. As Richard's condition deteriorated over the following 18 months, the contrast between Melissa's approach to the situation and mine became a source of increasing tension. She would emerge from visits with red-rimmed eyes, asking how I could remain so calm, so seemingly unmoved by my husband's decline. What she couldn't see were the hours I spent researching his condition after he fell asleep, the careful way I monitored every change in his symptoms, the nights I lay awake listening to his breathing, ready to respond to any distress. "They don't understand how much I love you," Richard whispered one night, about 2 weeks before he died. I knew he wasn't referring to the depth of my love, but to its expression, how I showed it through steady presence rather than visible emotion. "They don't need to understand," I replied, adjusting his oxygen line with practiced hands. "You do. That's enough." But it wasn't enough, as I would discover at his funeral. The careful emotional balance our family had maintained for decades was about to collapse under the weight of misunderstanding and unaddressed tensions. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was beside him, as I had promised I would. When his breathing changed, I knew what was coming. I held his hand and told him it was all right to go. There were no dramatic declarations or emotional outbursts, just the quiet authorization that he had completed his responsibilities in this life with honor. After he was gone, I sat with him for nearly an hour, my hand still holding his as it gradually cooled. The hospital staff quietly respected this private vigil. When I finally rose to make the necessary calls, my eyes were dry, but my heart felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been removed without external evidence of the extraction. "Mom?" James answered on the first ring, his voice immediately, alert despite the early hour. "Is it Dad?" "Yes," I said simply. "He's gone." It was peaceful. The silence that followed contained all the grief neither of us would verbalize. Finally, James cleared his throat. "I'll contact the funeral home. We made the arrangements last month. Should I come get you?" "No need," I replied. "I'll drive myself home once I've gathered his things." This practical exchange, focused on necessary actions rather than emotional expression, was exactly what I needed in that moment. A script to follow, tasks to complete, a way to move forward through a world suddenly emptied of the presence that had defined nearly 5 decades of my life. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday, allowing family members to travel from across the country. James took charge of the arrangements, consulting me on key decisions, but managing the details with his father's methodical attention. Melissa orchestrated the reception, ensuring there would be food, flowers, and appropriate music. I focused on writing Richard's obituary, carefully crafting a true accounting of his life and contributions. This task felt important, creating a public record of a quiet life well lived, documenting the impact he had made through decades of teaching and community service. The writing process was my private mourning ritual, a way of honoring Richard that suited both his nature and mine. For 3 days, I sat at Richard's desk in the study we had shared, surrounded by his books and papers, constructing and refining the narrative of his life. Each carefully chosen word was an act of love, each revised sentence a private ritual of grieving. The final version, 200 words that encapsulated 50 years of teaching, community service, and family life, was published in the Burlington Free Press 2 days before the funeral. The morning of the funeral arrived with inappropriate sunshine, the kind of perfect spring day that seems to mock the presence of grief. I dressed carefully in the navy suit Richard had always liked, applied minimal makeup, and secured my silver hair in its usual neat bun. The woman in the mirror looked exactly as she always had, composed, dignified, unchanged. Only I could feel the seismic shifts beneath that familiar surface. The service was well attended, the small church filled with former students, colleagues, neighbors, and friends. Richard had touched many lives during his decades of teaching, and those former students now occupied positions throughout the community. Doctors, business owners, fellow teachers, all come to pay respects to the man who had helped shape their understanding of the world. I sat in the front pew, James on one side and Emma on the other. Melissa had excused herself moments before the service began, saying she needed a moment to compose herself. When she returned, her eyes were noticeably red, her breathing uneven with emotion. Emma reached across me to squeeze her mother's hand, a gesture that seemed to both comfort and somehow intensify Melissa's visible distress. As the minister spoke about Richard's life and legacy, I focused on the polished wood of the casket, on the precise arrangement of white roses atop it, on the mathematical perfection of the folded flag that would later be presented to me. These details anchored me as I experienced a grief too profound for external expression. James spoke next, his eulogy precise and thoughtful, highlighting his father's contributions to education and community. His voice wavered only once, when, mentioning how Richard had taught him to build his first model bridge, the project that had inspired his career in architecture. Even in that emotional moment, my son maintained the composure that was our family's inheritance. When the formal service concluded, attendees were invited to share memories of Richard. Former students spoke of his patience, colleagues praised his integrity, neighbors recalled his quiet generosity. Each story added another dimension to the portrait of the man I had loved for nearly 5 decades. Throughout these tributes, I remained composed, nodding slightly in recognition of particularly accurate observations about Richard's character. Beside me, Melissa's emotional responses grew increasingly visible. Audible sniffles, dabbing at eyes, occasional muffled sobs. The contrast between our expressions of grief could not have been more pronounced. As the sharing concluded, the minister invited everyone to join the family at our home for a reception. People began to rise, gathering belongings and moving toward the exits. I stood, preparing to follow the casket for the final prayers before it would be taken to the cemetery for a private interment. That's when it happened. Melissa suddenly stood and turned to face the departing congregation. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "Am I the only one who actually loved Richard?" The room fell silent, people freezing mid-motion, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected outburst. Turned to me then, her face flushed with emotion and what I would later recognize as accumulated resentment. "Look at her," she continued, gesturing toward me. "Not a single tear for her husband of 48 years. Those would be crocodile. Tears anyway, she's incapable of real feeling." The accusation hung in the air like shattered glass, each fragment reflecting some distorted version of our family's truth. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Even the minister seemed at a loss for an appropriate response. In that suspended moment, as dozens of eyes turned toward me in shock and discomfort, I faced a choice that would define not just this moment, but the future of our fractured family. How I responded to this public challenge to my grief, to my very capacity for love, would either heal or permanently rupture connections that Richard had spent a lifetime nurturing. What happened next would indeed change our family forever, though not in the way anyone present might have expected. Time stretches strangely in moments of crisis. The seconds following Melissa's accusation seemed to expand indefinitely as I stood facing her across my husband's casket, the eyes of everyone we knew fixed upon us. In that suspended moment, 48 years of marriage and all that came before, it flashed through my mind, not as disconnected memories, but as a continuous thread of carefully built connection. Richard and I had constructed our life together methodically, intentionally, brick by metaphorical brick. Our relationship hadn't been built on grand passion or dramatic declarations, but on something far more enduring, the steady accumulation of shared experience, mutual respect, and quiet understanding. To have the authenticity of that bond questioned so publicly felt like watching someone take a sledgehammer to a cathedral we had spent decades building. I became aware of James rising from his seat beside me, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger I had rarely seen in my contained son. Emma remained frozen, her 13-year-old features caught between horror and confusion. The congregation seemed collectively paralyzed, witnessing a family implosion no one had anticipated at what should have been a solemn occasion of shared grief. The minister began moving toward Melissa, clearly intending to diffuse the situation, but I raised my hand slightly, stopping him with the same subtle gesture I had used for decades to quiet an unruly classroom. This was not a moment for outside intervention, regardless of how well-intentioned. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, taking in her flushed face and defensive posture. Behind her anger, I recognized something else, a profound pain I had not fully acknowledged before. Her accusation, while misdirected, came from genuine grief, not merely spite. "Melissa," I said, my voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. "Grief takes many forms. Not all of them involve tears." She laughed bitterly, the sound discordant in the sacred space. "That's convenient, isn't it? A perfect excuse for never showing what you really feel, if you feel anything at all." James stepped forward. "Mom, you don't need to respond to this. Melissa, this is completely inappropriate. We're leaving. Now." He reached for his wife's arm, but she pulled away sharply. "Of course you'd defend her," Melissa said, turning her frustration toward my son. "The two of you are exactly alike. Robots, pretending to be human. Your father deserved better than both of you." A collective intake of breath rippled through the congregation at this escalation. I noticed several people beginning to gather their belongings, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. This was exactly what Richard would have hated most. Discord at an event meant to honor his life, people leaving with memories of conflict rather than celebration of his contributions. "Melissa," I said again, more firmly this time, "this isn't about me or James or even you. This is Richard's day. He spent his life creating harmony where others might have fostered division. I won't dishonor that legacy by engaging in a public dispute, regardless of provocation." I turned to address the stunned congregation. "Friends, thank you for coming to celebrate Richard's life. As you've heard from so many today, he valued education, community, and civil discourse above all else. I know he would want us to part in the spirit of those values rather than discord." Then, in a decision that surprised even me, I walked directly to Melissa. Standing before her, I spoke quietly enough that only she, James, and Emma could hear. "Richard loved you, Melissa. He valued your expressiveness and passion. He often told me how much he appreciated the way you brought color into our sometimes too ordered world. Your grief honors him. But so does mine, even if it doesn't look the way you expect it to." Her eyes widened slightly. Whether in surprise at my approach or the content of my words, I couldn't tell. Before she could respond, I addressed the three of them collectively. "We will have much to discuss as a family, but not here, not now. For the moment, let's focus on honoring Richard together, despite our differences." I then turned back to the minister and nodded, indicating that he should proceed with the final prayers. He did so with visible relief, guiding us through the remainder of the service with practiced efficiency. The planned procession to the cemetery would include only immediate family, creating space for the privacy we so desperately needed after this public fracture. As the service concluded, I watched many guests approach James rather than me, murmuring awkward condolences before making hasty exits. A few of Richard's oldest friends and colleagues did come to embrace me, their understanding evident in the extended pressure of their hands, the knowing looks that required no explanation. They had known Richard, and me, long enough to understand that still waters often run deepest. The drive to the cemetery passed in weighted silence. James and I rode in the lead car behind the hearse, while Melissa and Emma followed in James's sedan. My son stared straight ahead, his profile so reminiscent of his father that I felt a fresh wave of loss wash over me. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally said as we turned through the cemetery gates. Melissa was completely out of line. "I've never been so embarrassed." "It's not about embarrassment, James," I interrupted gently. "It's about misunderstanding." Melissa wasn't wrong about everything. Our family does have difficulty expressing emotions in ways others can recognize. That's not inherently good or bad, but it can create barriers between us and those who communicate differently. He glanced at me, surprise evident in his expression. "You're defending her? After what she said to you at Dad's funeral?" "I'm not defending her behavior," I clarified. "I'm trying to understand it. There's a difference. Understanding doesn't require approval." The remainder of our journey passed in silence as James absorbed this distinction, one that Richard had often emphasized in his mathematics courses when helping students comprehend complex theorems. Understanding was the foundation upon which all meaningful progress was built. The graveside service was mercifully brief, the minister sensing the fragility of our family's temporary truce. As the casket was lowered into the earth, I removed my wedding ring, a simple gold band worn smooth by nearly 5 decades, and pressed it into the arrangement of white roses that would remain at the grave. This private gesture, unplanned and spontaneous, was perhaps the most visible expression of my grief I had allowed myself. Beside me, I heard Melissa's sharp intake of breath, followed by a muffled sob. Whatever she had expected of me, this wasn't it. For the first time, perhaps, she glimpsed something of my internal landscape, the profound connection that transcended my reserved exterior. When the service concluded, the funeral director quietly informed us that the reception at our home was ready whenever we wished to arrive. The caterers Melissa had arranged would manage everything. Our only responsibility was to receive guests and accept their condolences. "I'd like a few moments alone first," I said, looking not at the funeral director, but at my family. "I'll meet you at the house." James nodded, understanding my need for privacy, and guided Melissa and Emma toward the car. As they walked away, I heard Melissa's subdued voice. "I still don't think she really loved him, not the way—" The rest of her sentence was lost as they moved beyond earshot, but its essence was clear enough. Standing alone beside my husband's fresh grave, I finally allowed the carefully maintained wall within me to crack slightly. No dramatic collapse, that had never been my way, but a calculated release of pressure, like opening a valve on a steam pipe to prevent an explosion. "They never understood us, did they?" I said quietly to the freshly turned earth. "Not really. They couldn't see that our kind of love wasn't about grand gestures or emotional declarations. It was about building something enduring together, brick by brick, day by day." I knelt and touched the cool soil, feeling its texture against my fingertips. "I'll miss our Tuesday night discussions about whatever book we were reading. I'll miss waking up to find you'd already made coffee exactly the way I like it. I'll miss your terrible puns that you pretended were accidental, but actually spent hours crafting." These specific, tangible aspects of our life together were, for me, the true measure of love, the accumulated details of a shared existence deliberately constructed over decades. Richard had understood this language of love we shared, even when others couldn't translate it. Rising, I brushed the soil from my fingers and straightened my suit jacket. "I'll honor what we built together," I promised quietly, "even if that means building some new bridges I never expected to construct." With that pledge made, I walked back through the cemetery toward my car, already formulating a plan for what needed to happen next. Richard had always said I was at my best when faced with a specific problem to solve. Our family's fracture was Certainly that. A complex equation requiring careful analysis and methodical solution. Arriving at our home on Linden Street, I found the reception already in full swing. Cars lined both sides of the street, and the murmur of subdued conversation drifted from the open windows. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to enter a social situation I would have found challenging under the best circumstances, now complicated by the tension of our family's public rupture. Inside, conversations paused briefly as I entered, then resumed with slightly forced animation. I moved through the crowded rooms, accepting condolences with quiet dignity, thanking people for specific memories of Richard they shared rather than responding to generic expressions of sympathy. James approached as I was speaking with Richard's department chair, his expression a careful mix of concern and deference. "Mom, there's a problem with the caterers. Something about the heating trays not working properly. Melissa's trying to handle it, but she's upset." The unspoken message was clear. Another emotional crisis was brewing in the kitchen, one that threatened to spill over into the public gathering. I excused myself from the conversation and followed James to the back of the house where our spacious kitchen, Richard's domain more often than mine, as he had been the family cook, was now a scene of barely contained chaos. Melissa stood near the stove, gesturing emphatically to two young caterers who looked increasingly distressed. "This is completely unacceptable," she was saying, her voice pitched higher than normal. "These were supposed to be Richard's favorite recipes, and now half of them are cold, and the other half are practically burned." Emma hovered in the doorway, her adolescent face a mask of embarrassment and distress. She caught my eye as I entered, her expression pleading for intervention. Rather than addressing Melissa directly, I moved to the stove and assessed the situation with the practical eye of someone who had managed classroom crises for decades. Several warming trays had indeed malfunctioned, leaving some dishes cold while others had overheated. The caterers, barely more than teenagers themselves, seemed paralyzed by Melissa's emotional reaction. "The circuit breaker must have tripped," I said calmly, moving to the electrical panel hidden in the pantry. "This house is over a century old. The wiring can't handle too many appliances on one circuit." I reset the tripped breaker and returned to the kitchen. "That should resolve the power issue, but some of these dishes will need attention." Without waiting for response, I began rearranging the food, combining portions that were still at proper temperature, adjusting oven settings to reheat what had cooled. The caterers quickly joined in, relieved to have clear direction rather than emotional reaction. "Melissa," I said as I worked, "in the dining room sideboard, second drawer, there's a set of silver serving dishes Richard's mother gave us. They conduct heat exceptionally well. Would you mind getting them? They'll help keep everything at the right temperature once we've corrected these issues." Giving her a specific task, one that honored her role in the event while channeling her energy productively, provided a graceful exit from the emotional impasse. She hesitated briefly, then nodded and left to retrieve the serving pieces, the simple, purposeful action already calming her agitation. Within 15 minutes, we had reorganized the food service, the caterers were back on track, and the crisis had been averted without further public discord. As the last serving dish was arranged, Melissa stood beside me, both of us surveying the results of our collaborative effort. "These were really his favorite recipes?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I confirmed. "The butternut squash soup especially. He made it every Sunday in the fall for the last 20 years. "I didn't know that," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "There's so much I didn't know about him. About both of you." The simple admission contained an opening, a crack in the wall of assumptions that had separated us for so long. Before I could respond, however, James appeared in the doorway. "Mom, Mr. Abernathy would like to speak with you. He says it's important. Something about the faculty endowment Dad was organizing." The moment of potential connection with Melissa dissolved as quickly as it had formed. "Of course," I said, straightening my jacket. "Please excuse me." The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of conversations, shared memories, and the careful navigation of social obligations. By the time the last guests departed, leaving only our immediate family in the suddenly too quiet house, exhaustion had settled into my bones like winter damp. James began collecting glasses and plates, his innate tidiness asserting itself. "We should probably head home soon," he said, glancing at Melissa and Emma, who were quietly arguing in the corner of the living room. "It's been a long day for everyone." "Actually," I said, "I'd like all of you to stay tonight. There are things we need to discuss, and I think it would be better to do so after we've all had some rest." He looked surprised. Impromptu family gatherings had never been our style, but nodded his agreement. "I'll bring in our overnight bags from the car. We packed them just in case." With the decision made, we all moved through the rituals of settling in for the evening. Emma took the guest room she had used during countless weekend visits, while James and Melissa would sleep in his childhood bedroom, maintained exactly as it had been during his high school years, complete with architectural drafting tools and my tea pennant. I retired to the master bedroom, now painfully empty of Richard's presence. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside the book he had been halfway through when his final hospitalization began. His slippers remained precisely where he had left them beside the bed. I had changed nothing since his death, finding comfort in these tangible reminders of his methodical habits. Changing into pajamas, I moved through my nightly routine with practiced efficiency, washing my face, applying moisturizer, brushing my teeth for exactly 2 minutes as my dentist had always instructed. These ordinary actions anchored me in normalcy, even as the extraordinary events of the day replayed in my mind. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Grandma? Are you still awake?" Emma's voice was hesitant, barely audible through the wooden door. "Yes, come in," I called, tightening the belt of my robe. My granddaughter entered, her tall adolescent frame awkward in borrowed pajamas. She had outgrown the ones kept in her designated drawer. She hovered near the door, clearly uncertain of her welcome after the day's disruptions. "I'm sorry about what happened today," she blurted out. "At the church, and at the cemetery, and everything." "You have nothing to apologize for," I assured her, gesturing for her to sit beside me on the bed. "Adults sometimes handle grief poorly. That's not your responsibility." She settled beside me, her posture stiff with discomfort. "Mom says you don't really feel things like normal people do. That it's some kind of emotional deficiency." The last word emerged reluctantly, clearly a direct quote she was uncomfortable repeating. Rather than responding immediately, I reached for the photo album I kept in my nightstand drawer, a carefully curated collection I rarely showed to others. Opening it, I pointed to a photograph of a young woman with neatly pinned hair standing beside a grinning young man in a naval uniform. "That's me and your grandfather in 1975, the day before he left for a teaching conference in Chicago. I was 8 weeks pregnant with your father at the time, though we didn't know it yet." Emma studied the photo with interest. "You don't look very happy?" "No," I agreed. "I don't. But look at this." I turned the page to reveal a series of letters, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "These are the letters I wrote to your grandfather every day during that 2-week separation. He saved all of them." I removed one from its protective cover and handed it to her. "Read it if you'd like." Emma hesitated, then carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. Her eyes widened slightly as she began to read the words I had written to Richard almost 50 years earlier, words of such uncharacteristic emotional transparency that they had never been intended for any eyes but his. "Oh," she said softly after a moment, carefully refolding the letter and returning it to me. "That's different than how you talk." "Yes," I acknowledged, returning the letter to its sleeve. "Different cultures And different families have varying approaches to emotional expression. In my family, emotions were considered deeply private, something to be shared only with those closest to you, and often through writing rather than speech. That doesn't mean the feelings aren't there. They're just expressed differently. She considered this, her young face thoughtful. But Mom's family is different. Very different, I agreed. In her family, emotions are expressed openly, physically, verbally. Neither approach is inherently better or worse. They're just different languages for communicating the same fundamental human experiences. So it's like, you're speaking French and she's speaking Italian, but you're both trying to say the same thing? Emma suggested, her natural intelligence finding the perfect analogy. I smiled, recognizing in her quickness her grandfather's gift for precise conceptualization. Exactly. And because neither of you speaks the other's emotional language fluently, you both assume the other person isn't saying anything meaningful. She nodded slowly, processing this framework. Mom really is sad about Grandpa, she said, after a moment. She cries every night. Dad just sits in his office working on architectural plans until like 2 in the morning. They both miss him, but they're doing it so differently that they can't even see they're both doing the same thing. The insight was remarkably sophisticated for a 13-year-old, revealing an emotional intelligence that perhaps came from navigating between these different expressive styles her entire life. People often confuse the expression of emotion with the experience of it, I told her. Your grandfather understood that distinction better than most. It's why he was able to bridge the gap between my approach and your mother's for so many years. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I miss him, she said simply. I know, I replied, placing my hand over hers. So do I. We sat in silence for a moment, this simple acknowledgement creating more genuine connection than hours of more demonstrative interaction might have achieved. Finally, Emma spoke again. What are we going to do now? About Mom and Dad and everything? It was the question I had been considering since that moment in the church, when Melissa's accusation had laid bare the fractures in our family structure. With Richard gone, the careful balance he had maintained through diplomatic intervention was no longer sustainable. We needed a new approach, one that acknowledged our differences while building understanding across them. We're going to build some bridges, I said, echoing the promise I had made at Richard's grave. Tomorrow, we'll start constructing something new together, not by ignoring our differences, but by finding ways to translate across them. Emma nodded, seeming comforted by the concrete metaphor. She had grown up with an architect father and engineer grandfather. The language of construction was familiar territory. Can I help? She asked, her expression brightening with purpose. You'll be essential to the process, I assured her. You already understand both languages better than anyone. You'll be our translator. With that role defined, Emma seemed more settled. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, she rose to return to her own room, pausing at the door. Grandma? I'm glad we're staying over. And I'm sorry people think you don't have feelings just because you don't show them the way they expect. After she left, I sat for a long time with the photo album open on my lap, tracing the outline of Richard's face in those early pictures. We had built so much together over our decades of marriage, a home, a family, a legacy of education and community service. Now, in his absence, I faced perhaps the most challenging construction project of all, rebuilding the connections between the people he had loved most in the world. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and emotional terrain I had spent a lifetime avoiding. It would require me to step outside the carefully maintained boundaries of my habitual reserve, to find ways of communicating across the chasm of different emotional languages. Richard would have approached it as a mathematical problem, identifying variables and constants, working methodically toward a solution. I would approach it as an English teacher, recognizing that sometimes the most important stories require translation to be fully understood, that different narrative traditions can express the same fundamental truths, and that finding common vocabulary is the first step toward genuine communication. Setting aside the album, I turned out the light and lay in the darkness, formulating a plan for the day ahead. Unlike Richard, I had never been a natural mediator, preferring clarity to diplomacy in most situations. But I had learned from him over our decades together, absorbing his patient approach to human complexity alongside his appreciation for mathematical precision. "I'll need your skill for this, Richard," I whispered into the darkness. "Your ability to see multiple perspectives simultaneously." As I drifted towards sleep, I could almost hear his response, the quiet chuckle that always preceded his most thoughtful observations. "You already have everything you need, Eleanor. You just need to express it in terms they can understand." Translation, bridge building, finding common denominators across different emotional equations. These would be my tools for the work ahead. Work that would either heal our family's fractures or cement them permanently into place. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the opportunity to begin this essential construction project. For now, I allowed myself to rest, gathering strength for the challenging day ahead, a day that would indeed change our family forever, though not through confrontation but through the careful, deliberate building of understanding across our differences. I awoke before sunrise, a lifetime habit that even grief couldn't disrupt. The house creaked and settled in the pre-dawn stillness, its familiar sounds both comforting and painful in their reminder of Richard's absence. For nearly 5 decades, these early morning hours had been our private time together. Richard grading, papers at the kitchen table while I prepared lesson plans, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional murmured observation or the clink of coffee cups. Today would be different. Today would be the beginning of whatever our family would become in Richard's absence. Either something newly constructed from the fragments of our fractured relationships, or the permanent calcification of our misunderstandings into immutable barriers. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing clothes that balanced dignity with approachability. Charcoal slacks and a deep blue cashmere sweater Richard had given me for our 45th anniversary. "It matches your eyes," he had said when I opened the box, one of his rare direct comments on my appearance. The memory brought a tightness to my throat that I acknowledged privately before setting it aside to focus on the tasks ahead. Downstairs, the kitchen was exactly as we had left it the night before, clean but bearing evidence of the reception's controlled chaos. I began my morning routine, preparing coffee and setting out the components for a substantial breakfast. Cooking had always been Richard's domain rather than mine, but I had absorbed enough of his methodical approach to manage the basics competently. As water boiled and bread toasted, I reviewed the approach I had formulated during the night's quiet hours. Direct confrontation would only entrench existing positions. Emotional appeals would be foreign territory for me, and would likely be perceived as manipulative or insincere by Melissa, who had already decided my emotional capacity was deficient. Intellectual analysis. "Mom and Dad were arguing last night," she said after a moment, her voice carefully neutral. "After they thought I was asleep. Mom wants to go home today. She says being here is too painful and that you don't really want us anyway." I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though it confirmed my concerns about the fragility of our situation. "And your father?" "He thinks we should stay, at least through the weekend. He said there are practical matters to discuss about Grandpa's affairs." She arranged napkins beside each plate with careful attention. "But I don't think that's the real reason." I looked up from the batter, intrigued by her perception. "What do you think is the real reason?" She considered this, head tilted in the exact manner Richard would adopt when contemplating a complex equation. "I think he's afraid of what happens if we leave with things the way they are now. Like maybe the break would become permanent." Her insight was remarkably astute for a 13-year-old, though I had long observed her uncommon perceptiveness about interpersonal dynamics. While James had inherited Richard's analytical abilities, and I had contributed my literary sensibilities. Emma seemed to have developed an emotional intelligence that surpassed both her parents and grandparents. "I think you may be right," I acknowledged, pouring the first pancake onto the heated griddle. Sometimes distances that begin as temporary become permanent through simple inertia. She nodded, satisfied with this confirmation of her assessment. "What are you going to do?" Before I could respond, James appeared in the doorway, already dressed, in the same suit he had worn to the funeral, though without the tie. His hair was damp from showering, his expression guarded. "Good morning," he said, moving directly to the coffee pot. "You're making breakfast?" "Pancakes," Emma confirmed. "Grandpa's recipe." A shadow passed across James's face at the mention of his father, quickly controlled but not before I had registered its presence. He had always been skilled at masking emotions, but in that brief flicker, I glimpsed the depth of his grief, no less profound for being contained. "Is your mother joining us?" I asked, deliberately using "your mother" rather than Melissa, to emphasize family connection rather than the more strained relationship between us. "She's getting dressed," James replied, sipping his coffee. "She didn't sleep well." The unspoken context hung in the air between us. The argument Emma had overheard, the tension that had followed us from the funeral, the unresolved emotions that threatened to become permanent barriers. Rather than addressing these directly, I continued with breakfast preparations, asking James to retrieve maple syrup from the pantry and assigning Emma to slice fresh fruit. These simple, shared tasks created a temporary framework of normalcy within which we could begin to navigate the more complex emotional terrain. By the time Melissa appeared, we had assembled a credible approximation of the Sunday breakfasts Richard had orchestrated throughout Emma's childhood: pancakes, fruit, bacon, and the special orange juice he would prepare by hand-squeezing a specific combination of navel and blood oranges. The familiar ritual provided a tangible connection to him even in his absence. Melissa paused in the doorway, clearly surprised by the domestic tableau before her. She had dressed carefully in dark slacks and a subdued blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression wary. "Good morning," I said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "I hope you slept as well as possible under the circumstances." "Thank you," she replied with formal politeness that did nothing to disguise the tension evident in her posture. She sat beside Emma, across from James, leaving me at the head of the table, Richard's traditional place, now vacant in more ways than one. As we began serving the food, the silence grew increasingly uncomfortable. James focused on perfectly distributing butter across his pancakes. Emma darted glances between her parents and me, and Melissa maintained a rigid posture that spoke volumes about her desire to be elsewhere. Rather than allowing this tension to persist, I decided to approach our situation directly, but through the indirect means of Richard's memory, a bridge we all shared despite our differences. "I'd like to ask each of you to share a specific memory of Richard," I said as I passed the syrup to Emma. "Not a general quality you appreciated, but a particular moment that stands out in your recollection. Something that captures an aspect of who he was to you personally." The request was met with initial surprise, then thoughtful consideration. This approach offered a way to connect through our shared relationship with Richard while potentially revealing the different ways we had experienced and interpreted his presence in our lives. "Can I go first?" Emma asked, setting down her fork. At my nod, she continued, her young face animated by the memory. 2 years ago, when I was struggling with my geometry homework, Grandpa sat with me at this table for 3 hours. He didn't just show me how to solve the problems. He helped me see the patterns connecting them. When I finally understood, he said, "Emma, mathematics isn't about memorizing formulas. It's about recognizing the underlying structure of reality." She smiled at the recollection. Then he took me out for ice cream at 10 o'clock on a school night and told me not to tell Dad. He said sometimes celebrating understanding was more important than following rules. James looked startled at this revelation. Both the late-night ice cream expedition and the philosophical framework his father had shared with Emma. "He never took me for ice cream after math lessons," he said, his tone holding a hint of something that might have been jealousy or perhaps simple surprise. "Different relationships have different expressions," I observed quietly. "Richard connected with each of us in ways unique to that specific relationship." I turned to James. "Would you share a memory?" He considered for a moment, his systematic mind clearly sorting through decades of interactions to select a representative example. "When I was applying to architecture programs, I was torn between MIT and Cornell. I had pros and cons lists for each, but couldn't make a decision. Dad sat with me in his study and listened to all my analytical comparisons. When I finished, he said something I've never forgotten. 'James, when reason reaches its limits, intuition must take over. Your lists won't decide this for you.'" James stared at his plate, clearly moved by the recollection. He was the most logical person I knew, yet he was telling me to trust something beyond logic. It changed how I approached not just that decision, but many others throughout my career. The memory revealed something significant: Richard's ability to transcend his own natural tendencies when the situation required it, to recognize when his analytical approach needed supplementation from other ways of knowing. It was a capacity I had benefited from throughout our marriage, though I had never articulated it as clearly as James just had. Melissa shifted in her seat, her expression suggesting she was debating whether to participate or maintain her emotional distance. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "When James and I got engaged, I was nervous about meeting you both. I come from a big, loud Italian family where everyone says exactly what they're thinking all the time. James had warned me that his family was different." She twisted her napkin slightly, the only outward indication of her discomfort with the memory. "The first time I came for dinner, I accidentally broke a serving dish, a glass bowl I later learned had belonged to Eleanor's mother. I was mortified, waiting for the explosion of anger my family would have unleashed. Instead, Richard simply said, 'Now it has a story,' and helped me clean up the pieces." Her eyes met mine briefly before returning to her plate. Later that evening, he showed me his collection of Japanese pottery with gold seams where they had been repaired. He explained kintsugi, the philosophy that breakage and repair become part of an object's history, rather than something to disguise. "The Mitchell family approach to relationships is similar," he told me. "We acknowledge fractures, but try to repair them with care, making the mended places stronger than before." The memory startled me, not the incident itself, which I recalled clearly, but Richard's explanation to Melissa. He had never shared that particular metaphor with me, though it perfectly captured the approach we had developed over decades of marriage. Like James, I was discovering that Richard had shown different facets of himself in different relationships, adapting his communication to the needs and understanding of each person. "Thank you for sharing that," I said, genuinely moved by her recollection. "I wasn't aware he had explained our family philosophy to you in those terms." Melissa looked surprised by my response, perhaps having expected dismissal rather than appreciation. "He talked with me quite a lot, actually, especially when James was working late or traveling for projects. He would invite me for coffee and ask about my family, my work, my perspectives. This revelation created a momentary bridge between us, the shared experience of Richard's attentive interest, his capacity for drawing out others and honoring their unique viewpoints. For perhaps the first time, I recognized that Melissa might have lost not just a father-in-law, but a crucial ally in navigating our family's emotional landscape. When the attention turned to me, I found myself unexpectedly hesitant. My most meaningful memories of Richard were intensely private, moments of connection that had occurred in the quiet intimacy of our shared life, far from others' observation. There are thousands of moments I could choose, I began, setting down my coffee cup. But one stands out particularly today. On our 30th anniversary, Richard gave me a small wooden box he had crafted himself. Inside were 365 tiny slips of paper, each containing a specific observation about something he appreciated about me. One for each day of the coming year. I paused, the memory vivid despite the passage of time. What moved me most wasn't the grand romantic gesture, though it was certainly uncharacteristic of his usual reserved approach. It was the specificity of his observations. He had noticed hundreds of small details about how I moved through the world, things I hadn't realized anyone observed. The recollection created a momentary thickness in my throat that I worked to control, before continuing. Each morning for the next year I would read that day's note. Some were intellectual appreciations. The precision with which you analyze Faulkner's structural choices impresses me even after 30 years. Others were domestic. You align the spines of books on the shelf with mathematical precision I find deeply satisfying. And some were simply Richard. When you're deeply engaged in reading, you twirl a strand of hair around your left index finger, exactly as you did when I first met you. I looked up to find all three of them watching me with varied expressions of surprise. Richard observed everything, remembered everything. His quiet didn't mean absence of attention, quite the opposite. He took in details others missed and valued them precisely because they were overlooked by everyone else. The shared memories had accomplished what I had hoped, creating a momentary space of connection through our common experience of Richard's multifaceted presence in our lives. Each recollection revealed not just something about him, but about the unique relationship he had cultivated with each family member, adapting his natural tendencies to meet us where we were, rather than demanding we come to him. As we finished breakfast, the atmosphere had shifted subtly, not to comfortable harmony but to a less brittle tension. The shared memories had reminded us of what connected us beyond our differences, providing a foundation for the more difficult conversations still to come. I appreciate your indulgence in this remembrance, I said as Emma began clearing plates. But there are practical matters we should discuss as well. James mentioned affairs that need attention. James nodded, visibly shifting into the organizational mode that characterized his professional approach. Dad's will, the house, his pension, arrangements. There are decisions that will need to be made. I've prepared a list of the most pressing items. Of course, he had prepared a list. His response to any complex situation was systematic organization, just as Richard's had been. The familiarity of this approach brought a fleeting smile to my lips, quickly controlled, but not before Melissa had noticed. "You find this amusing?" she asked, her defensive posture returning. "Not at all," I replied calmly. I was simply struck by how much James resembles his father in his approach to problems. Richard would have had exactly the same response, a methodically organized list of tasks to address. Rather than placating her, this observation seemed to intensify Melissa's tension. Yes, they're exactly alike, treating human situations like mathematics problems to be solved through logical analysis. No consideration for the emotional dimensions involved. James stiffened beside her, clearly stung by the criticism but maintaining his composed exterior. "Melissa, this isn't the time." "When is the time, James?" she interrupted. "When will this family ever acknowledge that there are actual human feelings involved in life and death? Your father is gone, but everyone's acting like we're discussing a business transition." The fragile connection established during breakfast threatened to dissolve completely in the face of this renewed conflict. Emma froze in the process of stacking dishes, her eyes wide with the familiar distress of a child witnessing parental discord. Before James could respond, likely with the logical counter-arguments that would only escalate the situation, I intervened with an approach that surprised even me. "You're right, Melissa," I said quietly, All three of them turned to stare at me, clearly stunned by this unexpected agreement. Richard's death isn't merely a logistical problem to be solved, I continued. It's a profound emotional rupture for all of us, though we may experience and express that rupture differently. Before we address the practical matters, perhaps we should acknowledge the emotional reality more directly. Melissa's expression shifted from defensive anger to cautious surprise. What do you mean exactly? I mean that grief doesn't follow organizational charts or respond to logical analysis, I replied. It's messy, non-linear, and deeply personal. James's lists and my practical focus are how we manage overwhelming emotion, not evidence of its absence. But that doesn't mean the feelings aren't just as intense as those expressed more visibly. I rose from the table, moving to the sideboard where family photographs chronicled decades of shared history. Selecting one, Richard and James building a model bridge when my son was perhaps 10 years old, I placed it on the table between us. We're all grieving the same person but experiencing different losses, I said, touching the frame lightly. James has lost not just his father, but his intellectual mentor and the template for his own approach to the world. Emma has lost her grandfather and the unique understanding he offered that neither of her parents could provide. You, Melissa, have lost someone who bridged the gap between your expressive emotional culture and our more reserved one. I paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn before continuing. And I have lost my partner of nearly 50 years, the witness to most of my life, the person who understood me without requiring explanation. These losses aren't comparable or competitive. They're individual facets of the same fundamental absence. Silence that followed was different from the tense quiet of earlier. More contemplative, less defensive. Melissa studied the photograph, her expression softening slightly as she observed the evident connection between father and son captured in the image. "What are you suggesting?" James finally asked, his practical nature seeking concrete direction. Even in this emotional territory, I'm suggesting that before we address Richard's affairs, we each take time to articulate what his loss means to us personally, not to compete in grief or to establish whose loss is greatest, but to understand the different dimensions of absence we're each experiencing. I picked up another photograph, Richard with Emma at her kindergarten graduation. Perhaps understanding each other's grief might help us find ways to support each other rather than questioning the authenticity of our different responses. Emma, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke. "Like last night, when you showed me your letters to Grandpa. You were showing me that your feelings were real, even if they didn't look like what I expected." "Exactly," I confirmed, grateful for her intuitive grasp of the concept. Different emotional languages can express the same profound feelings. Melissa's defensive posture had relaxed somewhat, though wariness remained in her expression. "So you want us to... what? Take turns talking about how we feel about Richard's death?" "Not exactly," I replied, considering how to frame the approach in terms that would resonate with her expressive style while remaining authentic to my own. I'm suggesting we each share not just how we feel, but how we're experiencing the absence. What specific aspects of Richard we miss most acutely, what spaces in our lives his death has left empty. I turned to James, recognizing that this approach might be challenging for him as well, though for different reasons. This isn't about performing grief for each other's evaluation. It's about mapping the contours of individual loss so we can better understand our shared landscape. The metaphor was deliberate, framing emotional exploration in terms of mapping and architecture that would resonate with his professional sensibilities while inviting him into more vulnerable territory. James nodded slowly, processing the suggestion with his characteristic thoroughness. "That makes sense," he finally said. "Different perspectives on the same absence." He glanced at Melissa, something apologetic in his expression. "I haven't been dismissing your grief, you know. I just process things differently. It was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement he had ever made of their different emotional styles. A small but significant step toward the understanding I hoped to facilitate. Melissa didn't respond immediately, her internal struggle visible in her expression. Finally, she sighed. "I shouldn't have said what I did at the funeral. It was inappropriate and cruel." She looked at me directly for perhaps the first time since the confrontation. "I was upset, but that's no excuse. I'm sorry, Eleanor." The apology surprised me. Not that Melissa was capable of it, but that it emerged now, without pressure or specific prompting. It suggested her outburst had come more from pain than malice, as I had suspected, but not confirmed until this moment. "Thank you," I said simply. "I understand that grief can emerge in unexpected ways. I've never questioned the depth of your feelings for Richard, only perhaps the assumptions you've made about mine. This exchange, honest without being accusatory, direct without being confrontational, created space for the real work ahead. The fractures in our family relationships hadn't been magically repaired, but we had acknowledged their existence and taken first steps toward understanding their origins." "So how do we do this?" James asked, his practical nature seeking structure even in emotional territory. Before I could respond, Emma interjected with unexpected authority. "We should go to Grandpa's study," she said. "That's where he kept all his important things. Maybe being surrounded by his books and papers and everything that was important to him would help us connect better with what we're missing." The suggestion was insightful. Richard's study was indeed the space that most embodied his essence, containing not just his professional materials, but the collections and projects that had defined his interests beyond teaching. It was also neutral, territory in a sense, belonging fully to neither James nor Melissa nor even me, but to Richard himself. "That's an excellent idea," I agreed, rising from the table. "Shall we reconvene there in 15 minutes? That will give us time to clear breakfast and collect our thoughts." As we dispersed to complete these tasks, I found myself both apprehensive and cautiously hopeful about the conversation ahead. We were venturing into emotional territory I had spent a lifetime navigating privately rather than collectively, attempting to build bridges across different grief languages without a common vocabulary. Yet something had shifted since yesterday's painful confrontation at the funeral. The shared breakfast memories had reminded us of our common connection through Richard. Melissa's apology had acknowledged the harm of her public accusation. Emma's perceptive suggestions had provided a path forward that honored both emotional and practical considerations. Perhaps most significantly, I had taken steps outside my habitual reserve to offer a framework for understanding our differences. Rather than merely defending my approach or criticizing theirs, it was an approach Richard would have appreciated, finding the underlying patterns that connected our seemingly disparate experiences, just as he had done throughout his teaching career with mathematical concepts. As I placed the last breakfast dish in the dishwasher, arranged precisely as Richard would have done, a small private tribute to his methodical nature, I allowed myself to recognize the irony of our situation. In his absence, we were being forced to develop the very skills of emotional translation he had provided throughout his life. The bridge builder was gone, leaving us to learn bridge building ourselves if we hoped to maintain connection across our differences. It was perhaps his final and most important lesson that understanding across different emotional languages requires not just tolerance, but active translation, not just acceptance, but genuine curiosity about different modes of expression. 15 minutes later, we gathered in Richard's study, a book-lined sanctuary that smelled of leather bindings, pipe tobacco, though he had quit smoking decades earlier, and the faint citrus note of the furniture polish he applied religiously each Sunday afternoon. The room remained exactly as he had left it, his reading glasses perched on an open book, his favorite fountain pen laid precisely parallel to the edge of the desk blotter. As we settled into the available seating, James in the visitor's chair, facing the desk, Melissa on the small leather sofa beneath the window, Emma cross-legged on the oriental rug, and me in Richard's desk chair. I was struck by how each person oriented themselves differently to the space. James sat upright, his posture echoing his father's professional demeanor. Melissa perched at the edge of the sofa, still slightly separate from the room's essence. Emma integrated herself completely, physically connecting with the space itself. And I occupied Richard's position without fully claiming it, a temporary steward rather than a replacement. From this arrangement, unconsciously chosen yet revealing, we would begin the difficult work of articulating our individual grief while building understanding across our different emotional languages. What emerged from this conversation would indeed change our family forever, transforming Richard's absence from a source of division into an opportunity for deeper connection than we had managed even in his presence. Richard's study held the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime, shelves lined with mathematics texts and literary classics, folders containing decades of carefully preserved student work, collections that reflected his diverse interests from Japanese pottery to geological specimens. The room was a physical manifestation of his mind, ordered yet expansive, systematic yet curious about disparate fields of knowledge. As we settled into our places, I noticed Emma running her fingers over the spines of books on the lowest shelf, a collection of mathematics puzzles Richard had curated specifically for her, each one carefully selected to match her developing abilities. James studied the framed diplomas and academic awards on the wall, while Melissa gazed at the collection of family photographs arranged precisely on a side table. Each of us was connecting with different aspects of Richard's presence, even in his absence. "I think," I said after a moment, "we should begin with a simple acknowledgement. Grief is not a performance to be evaluated by others, but a private experience, to be respected even when we don't fully understand its expression." James nodded, his posture relaxing slightly at this framing. Melissa's expression remained cautious but open, while Emma looked between us with the hopeful attentiveness of a child witnessing potential reconciliation among adults she loves. "Perhaps I should start," I continued, "since my way of experiencing grief seems to have been most misunderstood." I turned slightly in Richard's chair, facing the window that overlooked the garden he had tended with mathematical precision. Perennials arranged in concentric patterns that created different visual effects depending on the season. "When Richard died, I felt as if someone had removed an essential structural support from my existence," I said, choosing my words with deliberate care, not in a way that caused immediate collapse, but in a way that required immediate recalculation of how to distribute the weight of daily life. I traced the edge of the desk blotter, a habit I had observed in Richard whenever he was formulating a complex explanation for students. My first response wasn't to express emotion outwardly, but to ensure stability, making necessary calls, arranging practical matters, creating structure to prevent total collapse. Looking directly at Melissa, I continued, "This isn't absence of feeling. It's a different management system for overwhelming emotion. Where your culture taught you to externalize feelings as they occur, mine taught me to process them internally, before expressing them in controlled ways." I opened the center drawer of Richard's desk and removed a small leather journal, one he had never seen. Each night since Richard's diagnosis, I've written to him about what I couldn't express directly. My fears, my gratitude, my anger at the arbitrary nature of his illness, my profound love for the life we built together. The journal represented a profound privacy violation for someone of my generation and temperament, yet I felt its revelation necessary for genuine understanding. I placed it on the desk without opening it, offering evidence of my emotional process, without exposing its specific contents. I don't cry publicly not because I feel less, but because I was raised to believe that private grief honors the depth of private love. My apparent composure isn't emotional deficiency, it's emotional discipline, the approach that makes sense within my cultural framework. Melissa studied the journal, her expression shifting from skepticism to something more complex. "You've been writing to him every night, even after he died?" "Yes," I confirmed. "It's how I translate between my internal experience and external expression, finding precise words for feelings that seem too vast or complex for spontaneous articulation." This revelation created a momentary bridge of understanding. While Melissa might not share my approach to emotional expression, she could recognize the authenticity of a daily writing practice maintained through the most difficult circumstances. "James?" I prompted gently. "Would you share your experience?" My son straightened in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the only visible sign of his discomfort with emotional disclosure. "I process grief through action," he began, his voice controlled but not detached. "Creating memorial structures, managing practical details, building physical representations of abstract feelings." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a miniature architectural model, a bridge constructed of wood and metal no larger than his palm. "I've been working on this since Dad's diagnosis," he explained, placing it on the desk. "It's based on the first bridge we built together when I was 10, the project that inspired my career choice. But I've incorporated structural elements from significant buildings in his life: the university where he taught, the church where you were married, this house." The model was exquisite in its detail and significance, a physical manifestation of connection across different life domains, a literal bridge between past and present. Most striking was its similarity to my own approach through the journal, a private, sustained creative process that externalized internal emotion in controlled, deliberate ways. "Each night after Emma and Melissa were asleep, I'd work on this," James continued, his voice slightly rougher. "Adding elements, refining details, creating a physical representation of what I couldn't articulate verbally. It was my way of processing what was happening." Melissa stared at the model, then at her husband, evident surprise in her expression. "You never told me about this," she said quietly. "I didn't know how to explain it," he admitted. "It seemed inadequate compared to your ability to express feelings directly." This honest acknowledgement of his perceived inadequacy revealed something crucial. James hadn't withheld emotional expression out of indifference, but out of a sense that his approach was somehow inferior to Melissa's more demonstrative style. The revelation created another bridge of potential understanding between them. Melissa's turn came next. Rather than beginning immediately, she moved to the bookshelves, scanning titles until she found what she was looking for: a volume of Italian poetry. She opened it to a marked page, where a pressed flower had been preserved between the pages. "Richard gave me this book for my birthday 5 years ago," she said, carefully removing the dried flower. "He had marked passages he thought I'd appreciate, poems about family connections across generations. It was so thoughtful, so specific to my interests." She returned to her seat, holding the preserved bloom carefully. "In my family, grief is communal and visible. We cry together. We remember loudly. We argue about who loved the person more or correctly as a way of processing our pain. There's no silent suffering, no private mourning. Everything is expressed and shared immediately." Her gaze moved between James and me as she continued. "When I see people not expressing grief outwardly, my instinctive interpretation, based on my cultural framework, is that they aren't feeling it deeply. It's not a judgment. It's a translation error. Like hearing silence and assuming there's no music rather than realizing someone might be listening through headphones." This metaphor, precise and immediately comprehensible, demonstrated a level of self-awareness I hadn't fully recognized in Melissa before. Her outburst at the funeral hadn't been merely emotional reactivity, but the product of genuine cultural misinterpretation, hearing silence and assuming absence rather than different transmission methods. "The thing is," she continued, twirling the dried flower stem between her fingers, Richard always made me feel understood, even when we communicated differently. He would listen to my emotional outpourings without judgment, then respond in his measured way that somehow still conveyed complete attention and care. Her voice wavered slightly. The model was exquisite in its detail and significance, a physical manifestation of connection across different life domains, a literal bridge between past and present. Most striking was its similarity to my own approach through the journal, a private, sustained creative process that externalized internal emotion in controlled, deliberate ways. Each night after Emma and Melissa were asleep, I'd work on this, James continued, his voice slightly rougher, adding elements, refining details, creating a physical representation of what I couldn't articulate verbally. It was my way of processing what was happening. Melissa stared at the model, then at her husband, evident surprise in her expression. "You never told me about this," she said quietly. "I didn't know how to explain it," he admitted. "It seemed inadequate compared to your ability to express feelings directly." This honest acknowledgement of his perceived inadequacy revealed something crucial. James hadn't withheld emotional expression out of indifference, but out of a sense that his approach was somehow inferior to Melissa's more demonstrative style. The revelation created another bridge of potential understanding between them. Melissa's turn came next. Rather than beginning immediately, she moved to the bookshelves, scanning titles until she found what she was looking for, a volume of Italian poetry. She opened it to a marked page, where a pressed flower had been preserved between the pages. "Richard gave me this book for my birthday 5 years ago," she said, carefully removing the dried flower. "He had marked passages he thought I'd appreciate, poems about family connections across generations. It was so thoughtful, so specific to my interests." She returned to her seat, holding the preserved bloom carefully. "In my family, grief is communal and visible. We cry together. We remember loudly. We argue about who loved the person more or correctly as a way of processing our pain. There's no silent suffering, no private mourning. Everything is expressed and shared immediately." Her gaze moved between James and me as she continued. "When I see people not expressing grief outwardly, my instinctive interpretation, based on my cultural framework, is that they aren't feeling it deeply. It's not a judgment. It's a translation error. Like hearing silence and assuming there's no music rather than realizing someone might be listening through headphones." This metaphor, precise and immediately comprehensible, demonstrated a level of self-awareness I hadn't fully recognized in Melissa before. Her outburst at the funeral hadn't been merely emotional reactivity, but the product of genuine cultural misinterpretation, hearing silence and assuming absence rather than different transmission methods. "The thing is," she continued, twirling the dried flower stem between her fingers, "Richard always made me feel understood, even when we communicated differently. He would listen to my emotional outpourings without judgment, then respond in his measured way that somehow still conveyed complete attention and care." Her voice wavered slightly. "With him gone, I feel like I've lost my translator, the person who could understand me across our different emotional languages. And at the funeral, seeing both of you so composed when I felt shattered inside. I reacted badly. I'm truly sorry, Eleanor." This second, deeper apology acknowledged not just the inappropriate behavior, but its underlying cause, the profound sense of being misunderstood, and the fear of being alone in her grief, without Richard's translating presence. Emma, who had been listening attentively to each adult's disclosure, finally spoke. "Can I share too?" she asked, looking between her parents and me with cautious hope. "Of course," I assured her. "Your experience is equally important." She moved to Richard's desk and opened the bottom drawer, removing a leather-bound notebook. I recognized immediately Richard's annual journal where he recorded significant observations and insights. She handled it with reverence, carefully opening to a page marked with a blue ribbon. Grandpa let me read parts of his journals sometimes, she explained. He said it was important for me to understand that people can experience things deeply even when they don't show it obviously. The last time I visited before he went to the hospital, he showed me this specific entry. She looked at me with a questioning expression, seeking permission to share Richard's private writing. At my nod, she began to read. Emma asked me today how I know Eleanor loves me when she rarely says the words directly. An insightful question from my 13-year-old granddaughter, who notices the differing emotional languages in our family. I explained that love exists in attention to detail, how Eleanor has memorized how I take my coffee and ensures it's prepared precisely that way each morning. How she places articles about mathematics education on my desk without comment, having recognized their relevance to my current research interests. How she remembers not just important dates, but significant intellectual anniversaries, bringing home champagne on the 40th anniversary of my first published paper without my having mentioned its approach. Emma looked up from the journal. There's more, but it's all like that. Grandpa explaining how he and Grandma showed love through attention and actions rather than words or dramatic gestures. He wanted me to understand different emotional languages. She closed the journal carefully, before continuing. When Mom and Dad argue, it's usually because they're speaking different emotional languages. Mom expresses everything immediately and directly. Dad processes internally before expressing anything. They both think their way is the only right way, or at least the better way. Looking between her parents with remarkable poise, she concluded, Grandpa was teaching me to be bilingual, to understand both approaches without judging either one as better or worse. Just different. This insight from a 13-year-old, delivered with clarity and without accusation, created a profound moment of collective recognition. Richard had been deliberately teaching Emma to navigate the different emotional styles in our family, preparing her to maintain connections that he perhaps anticipated would be strained after his death. James stared at his daughter with evident surprise, as if seeing a dimension of her development he hadn't previously recognized. Melissa's expression reflected similar reassessment, perhaps noticing for the first time how Emma had inherited not just physical traits from different family members, but emotional capacities as well. The silence that followed Emma's observation felt different from. James nodded immediately, perhaps relieved to have a concrete plan rather than remaining in ambiguous emotional territory. Melissa hesitated slightly longer before agreeing. Sunday dinners were important in my family growing up. It might be good for Emma to have that tradition too. With this tentative framework established, we moved to the practical matters that had initially prompted our gathering: Richard's will, his pension arrangements, decisions about the house and his belongings. These discussions, which might have been merely transactional before our emotional exchange, now took on a different quality, collaborative rather than divisive, focused on honoring Richard's legacy rather than asserting individual preferences. Throughout the remainder of the day, I observed small but significant shifts in our interactions. James made deliberate efforts to verbalize his thought processes rather than presenting only his conclusions. Melissa moderated her expressive tendencies slightly, creating space for different communication styles. Emma moved comfortably between these approaches, sometimes serving as translator when misunderstandings threatened to emerge. By late afternoon, as they prepared to depart, the atmosphere had transformed from the brittle tension of the previous day to something more balanced, not perfect understanding, but genuine willingness to work toward it. As James loaded their overnight bags into the car, Melissa approached me on the front porch, holding a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "This is for you," she said, extending it somewhat awkwardly. "I was going to give it to you at Christmas, but it seems more appropriate now." Unwrapping it carefully, I found a small ceramic dish, clearly handmade, with the irregular beauty of an amateur's passionate effort rather than a professional's technical perfection. "I've been taking pottery classes," she explained, watching my reaction closely. This technique is called kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The one Richard showed me years ago. The dish had clearly been broken and repaired, golden seams running through its blue-glazed surface like luminous rivers across a landscape. The repairs didn't disguise the breakage, but transformed it into something more beautiful than the original, unbroken surface. The pottery instructor says the philosophy behind it is that breakage and repair become part of an object's history, Melissa continued. That embracing flaws and damages creates something more interesting and valuable than perfection. The gift represented far more than a decorative object. It was a tangible acknowledgement of our broken relationship and a commitment to its repair. That Melissa had been learning this technique even before our current conflict suggested a longer-term recognition of the work our family needed than I had previously understood. "It's beautiful," I said, tracing one of the golden seams with my fingertip. "And deeply meaningful. Thank you, Melissa." She nodded, seeming both pleased and slightly embarrassed by the emotional significance of the moment. Richard would have liked it, I think. The mathematician in him would have appreciated the pattern of the repairs. Yes, I agreed. He would have seen not just the aesthetic appeal, but the underlying structure, the way apparent randomness creates its own form of order. This shared understanding of Richard's perspective created another small bridge between us. Not erasing our differences, but finding common ground within them. As they prepared to drive away, I felt cautiously optimistic about the path ahead. Emma hugged me tightly before climbing into the back seat, whispering, "See you Sunday for dinner, Grandma. I'll help cook." 6 months have passed since that pivotal weekend after Richard's funeral. The journey hasn't been linear or simple. Repair rarely is. There have been missteps and misunderstandings, moments of regression into old patterns of judgment and defensiveness. But there has also been genuine growth, careful construction of new understanding across our different emotional languages. Our Sunday dinners have become a family institution, alternating between my home and James and Melissa's. These gatherings aren't always harmonious, but they've developed a different quality from our previous interactions. More curious than judgmental, more intentional than habitual. We're learning to recognize that different expressions of emotion aren't competing approaches, but complementary perspectives, each revealing aspects of experience that others might miss. James has maintained his bridge-building project, expanding it into a series of architectural models that physically represent his emotional processing. He recently exhibited several pieces at a small gallery showing with an artist's statement that explicitly addressed how architecture can externalize internal emotional states. Melissa attended the opening, visibly proud of this public expression of his private process. Melissa has continued her pottery classes, developing considerable skill in kintsugi techniques. She's created a series of repaired vessels that she describes as family pieces, each one representing a relationship that has experienced breakage and repair. The piece representing our relationship has the most extensive golden seams, acknowledging both the significant fracture and the substantial repair work we've undertaken together. Emma has flourished in her role as family translator, developing remarkable emotional intelligence that allows her to move fluidly between different communication styles. She recently wrote an essay for school about bilingualism that focused not on spoken languages, but on emotional expression across cultures, using our family as her primary example. Her teacher was so impressed that it was published in the school literary magazine. As for me, I've continued my daily writing practice, no longer just private journaling, but also more direct communication with family members. When I recognize that my reserved approach might be misinterpreted, I make deliberate efforts to create windows into my internal experience, not changing my essential nature, but making it more accessible to those with different emotional languages. Today marks another significant milestone. We're gathering at my home to distribute some of Richard's personal belongings, items of sentimental rather than financial value that he specified should be shared among family members. In his typical methodical fashion, he left detailed instructions about who should receive which items, often with explanations that revealed his deep understanding of each person's connection to particular objects. As I prepare for their arrival, arranging coffee cups and plates of the cinnamon rolls Richard always made for special occasions, I find myself reflecting on the journey since that painful moment at his funeral when Melissa accused me of faking emotions. What initially seemed like a devastating fracture has ultimately led to deeper understanding than we might otherwise have achieved. The very public accusation that had humiliated me became, through our collective work, an opportunity to examine assumptions and build new frameworks for understanding across our differences. I place Melissa's kintsugi dish at the center of the table, its golden seams catching the afternoon light. It serves as a fitting metaphor for our family's journey, acknowledging breaks, valuing repair work, recognizing that mended places can become the strongest and most beautiful aspects of a relationship rather than flaws to be disguised. The doorbell rings announcing their arrival. As I move to welcome them, I carry within me not just grief for Richard's absence, but profound gratitude for what his loss has ultimately created. A family learning to translate across different emotional languages, building bridges of understanding. Where we once experienced only confusion and judgment, what happened at my husband's funeral, that public accusation of emotional fakery, did indeed change our family forever. But not in the way anyone might have predicted in that painful moment. Like the golden seams in Melissa's pottery, what ultimately emerged from our broken places was not perfect restoration of what existed before, but something new and possibly stronger. A family connected not despite our differences, but through the deliberate, careful work of understanding them. Richard, I think, would consider that a mathematical elegance worthy of the effort it required, finding the underlying pattern that connects seemingly disparate elements into a coherent, meaningful whole. And in that recognition, I feel his presence still guiding us, even as we learn to navigate without his physical participation in our ongoing story. As I open the door to welcome my family, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, I silently thank Melissa for that painful moment at the funeral that forced us to confront what might otherwise have remained forever unaddressed. Sometimes the most profound healing begins with the most painful break, just as the most beautiful kintsugi requires complete shattering before golden repair can transform it into something more valuable than its original unbroken state. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,